Hello and welcome. My name is Penny Meckley Porter. I am a therapist in Erie, PA, founder of Thrive Therapy Space, and I'd like to say thank you to the Jefferson Educational Society for hosting me. As you may know, we are in a series of talks and mindfulness exercises on the topic of ANTS, automatic negative thoughts. And the initial one, the introduction to automatic negative thoughts, was on the October 23rd of this year, 2020. So if you want to go back and look at the introduction to ANTS, it's on 1023, and you can find it on the Jefferson's Facebook page, on their website, or the Jefferson Educational Society YouTube channel. So let's get started. First, a little review. You might remember from last time. Last time we talked about all or nothing thinking. And this time we're going to talk about overgeneralization. So you might notice that there can be an overlap. So we're distinguishing between these 9 different kinds of automatic negative thoughts. There really is a lot of overlap. It's a valuable distinction to help you understand the different ways that we can have these cognitive distortions. So it's a valuable distinction, but you'll see a lot of overlap. So don't get too caught up in that, please. Okay. First, I'd like to start by saying we all experience cognitive distortions. It's a natural thing. It's our brain's way of trying to generalize and make shortcuts. But it's really good to have our eye on our own cognitive distortions, because our cognitive distortions can be related to different kinds of patterns in our life. Cognitive distortions are related to anger. If we're struggling with anger, they're related to depression, they're related to anxiety, they're related to low self-esteem. So cognitive distortions impact all of us. When you recognize cognitive distortions in your own life, and you're likely to, because as I said, we all experience them. When you recognize cognitive distortions, if there's any way that you can take a gentle attitude towards yourself and towards these distortions, rather than, oh my gosh, there's another one, I'm doing it again. That's all like real judgmental. So rather than being judgmental of yourself or shaming of yourself, trying to come at cognitive distortions from this perspective, like, oh, wow, I'm doing it. Other people must do it also, which is a fact. So just coming at it with a gentleness. So let's get started with this one that we're calling overgeneralization. This is another cognitive distortion. It's where a person comes to a conclusion, like a generalized conclusion, based on just like one incidence or a small number of instances of something happening, and they generalize. Obviously, they overgeneralize and come to a conclusion, or they think it represents an irrefutable fact about themselves. So let's start with, here's an example. If a student gets a poor grade on a math test, well, no, let's say exactly, how about if a student gets a poor grade on, what's it called? The times tables. This happened to me when I was a kid. Poor grade on times tables, and then the student just assumes that they're bad at math. Or maybe their parent might assume they're bad at math. Let's say the parent thinks they're kind of poor at math, and then the student fails or gets a bad grade on a times table, and then the parent's like, oh, you're bad at math like me. That's an example of overgeneralization. The student got one time a poor grade on times tables, or maybe even it's a couple of times, but it doesn't have to mean that they're bad at math. So as I talk about these examples, you can be looking for cognitive distortions, this overgeneralization in yourself or in other people. So the idea of looking for these in other people is not so you can go and tell them about it. It's just so that you can kind of be seeing it. And sometimes it's easier to see something in someone else and a little bit more difficult to see it in ourselves. So it's all to help you learn to identify overgeneralization in yourself, not so you can pick on anybody else. So another example, let's say Joe interviews for a job and Joe does not get the job and Joe decides he's bad at interviewing. Or maybe it's all or nothing thinking and he says, I'll never get a job. But we're not talking about all or nothing thinking right now as much as overgeneralizing. So maybe Joe did flub up the interview. It doesn't necessarily mean he's never okay for an interview. There could be other explanations, right? It could be that Joe didn't sleep well last night. It could be that Joe's daughter was awake last night. It could be that Joe forgot to have his coffee this morning, and normally he always has coffee. It's part of his routine. And so he was a little bit off this morning. There really could be other explanations. This one's a little bit more in depth. Let's say another homework one. Carl gets a C- on homework. He thinks to himself, I'm bad at this. I'm going to fail the class, and feels hopeless. So Carl's thinking is distorted in this case because the conclusion he's reaching is too broad given the evidence. So his C- could be a blip. You know what I mean? I don't know, sometimes things just happen. It could be a blip. Maybe he'll do well on tests in the future. It could be that there were some reasons why he did poorly on this test in particular. Maybe he was trying a new studying style. Maybe he was up a lot last night. Maybe it was just something that felt a little less intuitive than some of the other things that Carl normally studies. So we don't really want Carl to generalize that he's bad at test taking or generalize that he's bad at this topic. So one more example. Stella went out on a date and she was not asked for a second date, and she kind of wanted to be, and maybe she should have just called him up herself. But Stella was not asked out on a second date. And she remembers that this person had yawned while they were out on the date. And so her conclusion, she generalizes from the fact that he yawned. One person yawned on one date, and she generalizes and says, he was bored and I am boring. He was bored and I am boring. So then you can see that the generalization could obviously be difficult. And it could also make her feel, I don't know, demoralized, kind of defeated. And then we could see that feeling demoralized and defeated could impact her behavior. It could be hard to put forth any effort towards future relationships or even try to date anyone else. So those are some examples. You can kind of be watching yourself over the next week or 2 weeks, maybe watching other people, not to pick on them, but just to see overgeneralization in action. So the next question is, what do we do about overgeneralization? It's there. Most of us, if not all of us, do it. So what can we do about it? Well, we can take kind of a bit of a systematic approach towards it. First off is to consider the possibility. Is it possible I'm overgeneralizing? So that thing happened. I'm having a response to it. I'm feeling down, kind of negative, kind of angry at myself. Those could all be indicators that I'm overgeneralizing. But first off, ask myself the question, is it possible I'm overgeneralizing? Second thing would be to consider the evidence. What is the evidence for this conclusion I've come to? Am I basing this conclusion on a lot of relevant data or just 1 or 2 data points? Maybe even compare, if I can, what's the evidence for this conclusion that I'm really boring? We'll do the one with the gal who thinks she's really boring. What's the evidence towards this conclusion? And what's the evidence that does not support this conclusion? So the evidence for the conclusion is that the guy was yawning when I was out on a date with him. And the evidence against the conclusion is that People don't always yawn in my presence all the time. I have some lively friendships with some people who apparently don't think I'm boring. There can be evidence against my conclusion that I'm boring, but it's going to be really hard for my mind to go there. Once my mind goes to this conclusion that I'm boring, my mind kind of like wants to go to that conclusion. So this piece of like looking at evidence can be a little bit tricky. We got to practice this piece. Here's another question. Would the evidence you're considering that supports your negative conclusion or your overgeneralization, would the evidence hold up in court? Or is it kind of flimsy? Could an attorney like argue that, yeah, this gal, she's boring? It's conclusive. Probably not. So that's number one, is consider the possibility. Number two is consider the evidence. Number three is asking, is there a consistent conclusion? So based on the current facts, do you think everyone would draw the same conclusion? If not, like, why not? What other conclusions might someone draw? What are other possible explanations? I mean, a possible explanation for the guy yawning is that, well, again, he was up last night. He worked out today, had a big workout. He's feeling relaxed in my presence. There's a positive explanation. He's feeling kind of relaxed in my presence. It could be that he's a big yawner. There's really not enough evidence to be conclusive and to have it hold up in court. Another question would be, or another approach would be assessing a friend. Would you draw that same conclusion with a friend? So if I'm the person that feels like my conclusion is that I'm boring, I've overgeneralized, I'm saying I'm boring. Would I say a friend is boring if my friend went out with somebody one time and that person yawned once during the dinner? I probably wouldn't, actually. Another is to consider your feelings, because emotions can really get us off track. When our emotions get pretty big, they can, what's the word when they just kind of like grab our attention and detour. They can detour us pretty quickly. So when my emotions are big, my brain can go, ooh, like that, detour. When my emotions are big, it's likely that I'm letting my emotions guide my thinking about whatever's going on for me. Feelings do have a tendency to color our thinking. They alter our conclusions. They often exacerbate or exaggerate our natural thinking errors. And you know how earlier I indicated that thinking errors can be a part of depression? Well, it can be almost like a self-fulfilling thing, because when I'm experiencing thinking errors, it can increase depression. But then one of the things we have learned about depression is that depression can distort my thinking. So you can see that it can be a negative cycle, or like a self-fulfilling kind of cycle. And that's why it's good to learn about this and study this, maybe do a little more research and practice. Right now, I would like to, well, one, I'd like to see if you have any questions, but since this is pre-recorded, or this is a one-way video, I can't do that right now. But what I'd like to do is go ahead and do our mindfulness exercise for today. We'll take about 5 minutes or so, and we'll practice our deep breathing. We'll notice our thinking. We'll notice our emotions. We'll ground ourselves in the present moment. And all of these things can help us in the future in our practice of noticing overgeneralizations, noticing automatic negative thoughts. So I'd like to start by asking you to sit comfortably in your chair, feet flat on the floor, and close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. Go ahead and close your eyes and bring your awareness to your breath, noticing perhaps your chest cavity, the movement of your chest cavity, or the sound of your breath. With each inhalation and with each exhalation, there's the movement of your chest cavity and the sound of your breath. Keeping your awareness at the movement of your body or the sound of your breath. Again, keeping your awareness with your breath, just noticing the inhale and the exhale. If you do get distracted in thought, once you notice, you bring your mind back, calling it back like a little puppy dog. Come on back, sit, stay. And try to anchor your awareness again on your breath. I would like you now to notice your feet on the floor, your legs against the chair, perhaps your back against the chair. You're noticing yourself in the here and now. Kind of grounded against the chair. Your feet are grounded against the floor, meaning that as you're touching the floor with your feet, as your body is touching the chair, there's probably an energy exchange, or there is an energy exchange between the earth and yourself. That's what we call grounding. Again, noticing your feet and your body against the chair. Now, please bring your awareness to yourself sitting in the room, kind of using your mind's eye to be observing yourself on the chair, in the room. Perhaps you know where the chair is positioned in the room. It's a way of observing yourself there, sitting there. And then bring that same power of observation to observing your thoughts. Maybe you're not having many thoughts. Maybe you're just kind of listening to me. And it's been pretty straightforward for you to kind of listen and follow your breath, notice your body. But perhaps you have been having thoughts as we've been going along. I'd like you to notice your thoughts now. And then let go of the thoughts if possible. Sometimes that's difficult. When I notice my thoughts, generally I get completely caught up in them. I'm not actually that good at this sometimes. But we can picture a river. So when I notice my thought, it's like picturing that my thought is in like a fast moving river. And my tendency is to almost like be in that river as part of my thought. But then I make this effort to be sitting on the riverbank, observing my thoughts so that my thoughts are flowing with the river. And I'm sitting on the riverbank, observing my thoughts. So there you are, observing your thoughts. Good job on that. Practice. Now I would like you to observe your emotions. So feel your emotions in your body and notice them. Ask yourself, how am I feeling? And listen in your body, in that place where you normally feel your feelings. For many people, it's in the chest area, but it's different for everyone. And different feelings you can feel in different places. So just check in now with that part of your body where you often feel a lot. Notice your emotion or emotions, if you can label them. Honor whatever is there. So we've checked in with our thoughts and checked in with our emotions. Now I'd like you to come back to your breath. And also reground yourself. Feel your feet against the floor, your legs and perhaps your bottom on your chair, your back on your chair. So coming back to the breath and regrounding. And then whenever you're ready, I'd like you to open your eyes. Come back to the room that you're in and open your eyes. So good job on that mindfulness exercise. If it was imperfect, that's exactly what we would expect. So the reason we did that mindfulness exercise is part of this kind of discussion on overgeneralizing is we always want to be practicing how to be mindful. And so over the next week, now that you've listened to this today, and you might listen to it again to just kind of each time I find I listen to something, I absorb kind of different pieces to it. So over the next week, you can be kind of checking in with yourself, wondering if maybe you have overgeneralized. And so you can be checking in a given moment. Let's say you get upset. You could check in with yourself to see if you're overgeneralizing. But when you're upset and emotions are high, it's more difficult to do this. And so if emotions are high, you're like, no, I'm not overgeneralizing. This is all completely valid. I was rejected. I am boring. When you notice when emotions are high, all right, that's what you notice. And after you've calmed down, it could be 30 minutes later, hours later, days later. Maybe you want to come back and check on yourself and see if perhaps you were overgeneralizing. You can look for the data. You can see what your thoughts were. You can check in with yourself and your emotions. So thank you for being here today as we talked about overgeneralizing. Next week, we are going to be talking about discounting the positives. So today is the second in a 9-session series on automatic negative thoughts. So next week will be the third. It'll be discounting the positives. And I hope you will join us next week. You can always find these recorded, but if you'd like to join us next week, it would be live at the Jefferson Educational Society Facebook feed at noon. Thanks again for being here today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.